Most of the time when we hear the word conscientious, people immediately associate it with someone who is being a conscientious objector, such as Alvin York, a man who originally objecting to fighting became one of our early heroes and was decorated highly in World War I. But in fact, that association with the idea of being conscientious is so strong that next to it in the dictionary, you will often see the word pacifist immediately next to it, as if those automatically go together, being conscientious and being a pacifist. But the word itself has to do with a concern for doing things the right way. That's really what being conscientious about something is. And so someone who is conscientious has internalized what is right to such an extent that his conscience, you see the connection between those words? His conscience will allow for nothing else but what is right as he goes about his business. Whenever we think about leadership, we don't often think about this connection of being conscientious about it. The higher one rises in responsibility, the more important being conscientious about it becomes. It really has to do with you take your job seriously, that it is something that really matters, and therefore because it matters that much and it affects more people, the more you're involved, then doing it the right way is essential. So the more responsibility that you take on, the more people you lead, well, the fewer people you have available to you to make sure you're on the right track. That has to be something you take and do. You have fewer people to call for advice. Immediately, when you take a step in terms of what you're doing at any level of leadership, you can't talk to just anybody because not everyone understands. You have fewer people who appreciate then the challenges that you're facing in those times. And that's why you must learn to rely on yourself and God to get you through as you approach these things. And this is at the core of being a conscientious leader. Nehemiah stood in just that kind of position as he led the effort in the return from captivity to build the wall around Jerusalem. And when you saw that in him rebuilding these walls all around, the people needed a leader, someone who was there for them and for God, and that's who Nehemiah chose to become. And I think that's important. It shows where his heart was and what he was willing to take on. And he led them in reestablishing the people in the land, but also being a people who were committed in every way to doing what was right. Please turn to Nehemiah chapter 10, which will be our text for this evening. As you go through and you look at the text of Nehemiah, the first thing that steps out at you is this list of names. We won't read all of them for the sake of time. But what they do at the beginning is they establish and set a seal, and that was a literal seal. They put their mark, signed their name on this covenant. We're keeping it. We're doing it the right way. And then it follows, they made a covenant in sealing that covenant and followed through personally, individually with what they did in life. And then as it closes in the chapter, they were offering things to make it come about. So that's our basic structure for this evening as we're going to look at this text and to use it to realize what, and this was not Nehemiah, but the whole of the leadership was doing and showing how they truly were conscientious and taking seriously their role. And so we begin by noting what a conscientious leader will do. A conscientious leader makes it clear where he stands. That's the beginning point. That's what the sealing of the covenant is all about. They were coming up and they were saying, this is where we stand. We're taking our stand on God's covenant. And what a great and important lesson that is. In 2 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 12, there Paul writing said, therefore, since we have such hope, we use great boldness of speech. We're going to make it clear to everyone, as Paul always did, here's where I stand. That's the beginning. You know, legend has it that Colonel William B. Travis, during the siege and before it at the Alamo, drew a line in the sand, an actual literal line, and it's hard to verify that by anyone because all the witnesses are gone. But that he drew a line in the sand in saying, here's what you're up against. This is what we're fighting for. We're not going to survive. Who will stand with me? And it's understanding the clarity of that line that's important. It is very difficult to lead the right way when there's no clarity about the direction you're leading, what you're standing on. But when people know here's where you stand, there can be no doubt then of why you're doing what you're doing. And it gives you such strength that people say, that's why he's doing that. And so a conscientious leader can look at that and say, he's going to clearly say, here's where he stands. And that manifests itself in a number of ways. That begins because they have to know where they stand. If you're going to be a conscientious leader, you first have to know where you stand before you take your stand. If you don't know what it is you're standing on and why, it's hard to stand. You end up wishy-washy, going here and there. And we see that a lot of times in spiritual things, about in the religious world, people letting politics and everything else determine where are we going to stand on this issue. Oh, women in the church, homosexuality. Well, once you've taken your stand on God's word, that doesn't ever come up. Why? Because you want to do things the right way. You've taken your stand with God's word. And that's not an issue, therefore. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 15, Paul said, therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you have been taught, whether by word or our epistle. Here's where you take the stand. It's laid out. Here's what I'm standing on. That's where you ought to be standing too. So it has to have a clarity, first of all, by the leader as saying, this is what is right, and to know it personally of what is right. But then you have to take the stand. You can't just be that person who says, I know what's right, but never let anybody else know. You've got to take the stand at some point. In 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, it says, watch ye, stand fast in the faith. Quit you like men. Be strong. There are going to be times when you're going to have to take a stand for what is right. Take a stand for the covenant. Take a stand for saying this is how God has said things, and therefore the person has to be ready. Now, if you are leading in a different capacity, the same thing is still true. You know, a business leader is still going to have to say, here are the standards by which I conduct my business, and I'm not budging from that. And there are all sorts of things that can happen that can kind of make that hard. But you take a stand and say, no, this is who I am. This is how I operate. This is what I do. But you've got to be willing to get it out, and that means making a decision that reflects the stand you already took originally. But within this, too, in making this stand, if you're a leader, the broader the leadership, you have to publicize it. In other words, if other people don't know you've taken a stand, then have you really taken a stand? It's hard to kind of say that. If you're not willing to stand out there and say, here's where I stand, you know where I stand, they say, what? It's not the same. In Acts 2, verse 14, Peter is getting ready. He's just beginning to take a stand with the first gospel sermon. And when he stands up for the 11, it says he, noticed all these words, raised his voice and said to them, men of Judea and those who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and heed my words. I want to make this clear in this way. Here's where I stand. And so he's making sure it's out there. There has to be then a recognition that it's internal. It is going to be manifested and backed up by behavior. And then it is publicized, that is said to others, saying, I'm willing to put this out there that this is the right thing to do. That's being conscientious about it. And then you have to stand where you stand. What? It means once the stand is in the right place, there's no reason to ever leave it. If you've taken the stand correctly in the faith, this doesn't mean never change your mind. That's different. If you've learned that you were wrong, you better change your mind. But when you know you've been in the right, and this is standing on the right, what possible reason is there to ever leave? You stand where you stand. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13, there the Apostle Paul writes, "Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in that evil day, and having done all, to stand." That is, you've taken all this preparation to get you to this point, to know what you're supposed to be doing, where you're supposed to standing. Now do it. And here's the thing. You don't always know going into it when you're going to have to stand and what you're going to be against when you have to take your stand. There's no one who's ever become an elder who's known everything he was going to have to do and stand up for afterwards. That's one of the hardest things about it. It's the willingness, though, to stand on truth and make that commitment going in. It's one of the things that makes men stand out. Why? Because you're conscientious about it. We take it that seriously, and that's why they can be counted on always to do that. Real leaders stand up for the cause they lead because they believe in it, they are committed to it, and they refuse to compromise it. And when you find men like that, they are to be valued, commended, supported, and strengthened. Why? Because they are showing you that they are conscientious and they take their leadership, and that includes leading you, seriously. And that's what it takes. Second of all, conscientious leaders are conscientious about how they live. In verses 28 through 31, I do want us to read this section. It says, "Now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the Nethinim, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the land to the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone who had knowledge and understanding, these joined with their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and to do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and his ordinances and his statutes. We would not give our daughters as wives to the peoples of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. If the peoples of the land brought wares or any grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day, and we would forego the seventh year's produce and the exacting of every debt." Now notice the extent to which they, on a very personal level, are taking seriously about how they're going to live and conduct themselves. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12, Paul says, "I know whom I've believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day." That is, there is an internal, personal commitment to here's who I am and how I live that transcends his role as an apostle. Paul's faith was not in his apostleship, it was in Jesus Christ. And those are very important distinctions. We often think of George Washington as our first president, outstanding general, and a founding father. But do you know, before he accomplished any of these things, when he was a young man, he determined how he would live. Now, he didn't do it how I would recommend, which was read his Bible. But what he did was he copied down, there was a handbook at that time, very important in that culture. He copied down by hand 110 rules of civility and decency that his schoolmaster had required. And he kept those with him through his life and did his best to live by them. Now notice how conscientious he was in his manner of dealing with others, with his soldiers, all of that you see, the way he ruled, all actually can be traced back to his commitment to those principles. A conscientious leader. Well, notice, based upon our text, conscientious leaders then, in how they live, they're not afraid of being distinct. Did you see here when it talks about how they separated themselves from the peoples of the land to the law of God? They weren't afraid of being distinct. They embraced being distinct, to be different. They expected to stand out from the crowd. And that's as it should be. That ought to be true for all of us. But to say, I'm not going to be like that. That may be the common thing. It may be the popular thing, but it is not my thing. Therefore, they should be true in standing for holiness and becoming holy, distinct. Be ye therefore holy, because I am holy, saith the Lord, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 16. So that doctrinally and morally, they live their lives and stance in such a way that they are distinct from everything worldly. That doesn't mean they are to be perfect any more than when it says in our being holy that perfection is required. That's the beauty and the love of Jesus Christ and his blood. 1 John chapter 1, 6 through 7. But striving for holiness and making obvious separation is expected of being right and doing things the right way. I'm not wanting to look around at the world and say how they do things. No, that's not the way we do it. Why? Because we want to be distinct. Don't be afraid of that. They're also determined to do everything the right way. Again, that's at the heart of being conscientious. In verse 29, notice what they were trying to do. They took an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God and his ordinances and statutes. Do everything the right way. This begins with having integrity to seek out what is right. In Ezra 7:10, remember the first thing that Ezra did was he prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord, to do it, and then to teach in Israel commandments and statutes. It was the seeking of it that matters. You're not going to get truth. You're not going to get to God's law. You're not going to get to obedience if you don't seek it. And so part of this in determining to do things the right way is having a commitment to say, I'm going to figure out the right way. I am not making a claim to already know everything, but I am making a claim to determine to the best of my ability to find it out and to do it. That's the heart. That's the heart of being conscientious about your work. And in leadership, it applies because it says, how is everybody doing? How can I get that done exactly the right way? Conscientious leaders then protect their families. And I bring this up to make sure that you appreciate this in leadership. When you look down and see in verse 30 what they were doing, we would not give our daughters as wives to the peoples of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. Now, part of that, of course, is they're following the law. But they're personalizing the law to the point of where we do everything we can to protect our family morally. And so appreciate when they take those things seriously. When they need family time and husband and wife needing to get away, understand that's a right thing. That's a good thing. They're treating the right kind of things as having value and purpose. They're being conscientious about it. And I would say that probably preachers are more guilty of failing on this than elders, of neglecting family to the expense of their work. But the whole point is you got to lead your family first. And then you have and move over and start working and helping others. They will have it no other way because they want to do it the right way. And that means also that we should not balk at that, but we ought to appreciate it at every level. The hard one, I think, these others are straightforward enough, but you have to be willing to make the right sacrifices. Being a conscientious leader and doing these things, you got to make the right sacrifices. Notice what it says in verse 31. If the peoples of the land brought wares or any grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath, or on a holy day. We would forego the seventh year's produce and the exacting of every debt. There were certain things they would not do, even though it might be easier on them personally. They're not going to do it, and there are a couple of reasons why. The principle in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus saying, the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. That is, there's something higher and more important than even self-preservation. Well, there are two things that were going on here. There's a sacrifice that you have to make sometimes in order to be faithful. Doing the right thing sometimes means making sacrifices. They were refusing to do certain things to be faithful. Revelation 2 verse 10, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee the crown of life. Someone who takes that seriously, they're not going to do the wrong thing, even though it'll be easier, may make people happier, but they're not going to lead you in the wrong direction or do the wrong thing just because it's easier. They're going to make that sacrifice of maybe it being tougher and harder on them because that's where their heart is, of doing right. And they also are going to sacrifice at times just to be the right example for you. There may be some things that they have the right to do, but they don't do because of how it might affect you. Remember, there are certain things that Paul said he would forego for the benefit of the brethren. He didn't accept some money because in the case of some, he's afraid they'd think that he was coming in like everybody else and just doing it for the, giving a speech, expect payment. He didn't want that. He did not want them to get the wrong idea, and therefore he made a sacrifice. And though it's in different ways, leaders have to do that from time to time. To make sacrifices that are small in order to make sure principle is winning in what they're leading every time. Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1. Real leaders do not simply play the role of leadership then, they live the life of leadership. The life comes together. It has to be there and coalesce. And the people who follow, you should be able to tell the difference. To recognize that this is a man who lives it. My friends, that's not always the case. And because it's not always the case, where you see it, it should be commended, appreciated, and followed with encouragement. Thirdly, conscientious leaders hold themselves accountable. Verses 32 through the remainder of the chapter. Also, we made ordinances for ourselves to exact from ourselves yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, for the regular grain offerings, for the regular burnt offering of the Sabbaths, the new moons and the set feasts, for the holy things, for the sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel and all the work of the house of our God. We cast lots among the priests, the Levites, and the people for bringing the wood offering into the house of our God, according to our fathers' houses at the appointed times year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God as it is written in the law. And we made ordinances to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all fruit of all trees year by year to the house of the Lord, to bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of our God. To bring the first fruits of our dough, our offerings, the fruit from all kinds of trees, the new wine and oil to the priests, to the storerooms of the house of our God, and to bring the tithes of our land to the Levites, for the Levites should receive the tithes in all our farming communities. And the priest, the descendant of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive tithes, and the Levites shall bring up a tenth of the tithes to the house of our God, to the rooms of the storehouse. For the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the offering of the grain or the new wine and the oil to the storerooms where the articles of the sanctuary are, where the priests who minister and the gatekeepers and the singers are, and we will not neglect the house of our God. Now that is a specific reaction to what had happened before the captivity. There had been great neglect. If you recall, there had to be this great effort made to kind of restore it because it was in such bad shape. It had been neglected. So what they are saying here is we are taking a stand and holding ourselves accountable that we won't let that happen again. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, Paul said of himself, I discipline my body, New King James, and bring it into subjection, lest, he says, when I preach to others, I should be a castaway, unqualified. Idea is failing the test. And so a leader should not need much external motivation to lead well because he should have such strong internal motivation that constantly calls him to strive for excellence, to hold himself accountable in those ways. Jascha Heifetz, who is a violin virtuoso, he once said this: "Criticism does not disturb me, for I am my own severest critic. Always in my playing, I strive to surpass myself, and it is this constant struggle that makes music fascinating to me." That, I submit to you, is the attitude of a conscientious leader. It should be for a conscientious Christian, of saying, don't worry about competing against others. Compete against yourself to be better, to what you ought to be and can be. Hold yourself accountable in every way in which it applies. For leaders, it applies in specific ways. The first being work. And they have to hold themselves accountable for their own work, because who else does? How can you? You do not see all that the elders do. You cannot. They have to hold themselves accountable for that, which is really verses 32 and 33. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 3, in talking about all Christians, he talks about the work of faith and labor of love. Take that and multiply it a number of times to appreciate what that means to come from faith and from love for the work of an elder. There has to be a heart there that is so conscientious about it, to getting that work done and doing it the right way, so that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, 12 and 13, there Paul told the Thessalonians of their leaders, generally speaking, "And we urge you, brethren, to recognize those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord, and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love for their work's sake. Be at peace among yourselves." For their work's sake. That is, there's where the value you end up benefiting from, but the labor comes from within. Another one that's hard is holding yourself accountable for time. Why? Because a lot of times, remember, there's already major time commitments that men have made. And now they're committing additional time. In Ephesians 5 verse 16, it says we're to redeem the time. Make the best use of it. Buy it up. And when you already have all this time already committed over here, maybe to a job or something else like that, well, you better really have to work. And it takes a lot of internals to take up the rest of that time when you're tired and you don't necessarily have all the energy, but this has to be done. What makes the difference to get it done? Being conscientious about it, having a heart for it, realizing that's what needs to be done. Conscientious leaders also hold themselves accountable to the people they lead. That is, there's a sense of responsibility in saying, okay, you're following, I need to make sure I get you where you need to go. You know, if a business leader, and I think that if you're an employee, you don't think of it this way, but that business leader has a certain responsibility because he's the one that has to make sure you can have a paycheck. You just take it for granted he's going to give you a paycheck. He's the one who has to make sure there's enough money so you can have a paycheck. Well, spiritually speaking, that same principle of that sense of responsibility to say, there are people who need this, is there. And so conscientious leaders know that and are constantly trying to figure out how to make sure that need is fulfilled. In Hebrews 13:7, and then later in verse 17, it says, "Remember those who rule over you have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow, considering the outcome of their conduct. Obey those who have the rule over you and be submissive, for they watch out for your souls, as those who must give account. Let them do so with joy and not with grief, for that would be unprofitable for you." That is, to recognize and appreciate the heart that goes into leading you. But if you notice that last part in verse 39, conscientious leaders hold themselves accountable for the future. And I mean it in this way. They can't control the future. But they have their mindset on looking and saying what will happen in the future. What can we do to prepare for the future? What is going to be best for this person in the future and that person and this family? Look, one of the reasons why family is our theme this year is understanding how that affects you and your soul and your destiny and your children's soul and destiny. That's why they did that. Why? Because they're looking to the future of the souls of the congregation to prepare everyone here and your family for heaven. You, therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus, and the things which you've heard among me, among many witnesses, commit these, he says, to the faithful men who will be able to teach others also. That's the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy 2, 1, 2, thinking about the future and taking it so seriously, saying, I'm not, and remember this is the last thing he wrote, I may not be there for that future, but I want it to be a bright future. That's a conscientious leader. And that's why a conscientious leader has to consider all these things and not make, they have so much to consider in making any kind of decision. Because it cannot be just limited in a vacuum, but to say, what affects you in your life when you leave here? And what can help that? And that's the heart at work. Real leaders raise the standards for the organization they lead and for the people who follow. And they do so by first raising the standards for being a leader by how they lead. They say, we want to do more and show you, but more can be done, that you can do more. And it's such a powerful thing and a thought to get across to say, yes, we can move forward. Follow us. The current state of leadership at the, shall we say, geopolitical level, in general, I'm not going to specify anybody here, so don't make any assumptions about that. But it's, on the whole, let's say it's filled with greedy, selfish, power-hungry people. Many of them who want to use the position that's given to them in order to help themselves. I don't think that's all of them, but I think there are plenty. Conscientious leaders, on the other hand, are sacrificial and unselfish, empowering others and strengthening others because they have a dedication to a cause other than and greater than themselves. That's what being a conscientious leader is all about. Nehemiah and these men who were with him at this moment typified just such leadership as this. And you can see its effect by the way how many others and the people adopted the same attitude. It was infectious. Nehemiah did not go to Jerusalem to enrich himself. It was in poverty. He wasn't getting anything out of that. He did not go to Jerusalem to promote himself. He left a high-profile position behind. He did not go to Jerusalem to control others. He went to serve God. Nehemiah left Jerusalem and the people of Judea far better off, though. And it was because of his leadership. It was because he was conscientious about his leadership. It was because of his heart. And that will be the goal of anyone who is truly a conscientious leader. Oh, when you see this in people that are leading, honor it, appreciate it, and follow. Because this heart for people, for God, and for growth is essential for you. You ultimately benefit from someone's heart like this. And that's why it ought to mean everything to you, especially in the Lord's church. When you have that, there is a drawing to it because I can do better. They believe in me. They love me. They're doing things that care for me. It's a heart of leadership. And it ought to draw out in us the very best of followership that we can bring together. You know, when Jesus extended his invitation to come and follow him in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30. He was offering them something better. Jesus came, and long before his heart burst from all the agony of the cross, he had already given his heart to the people that he was teaching. The people he went to the cross for, that includes us. His heart took him to the cross. And that's why we should go back there too. We meet him at the cross with such a heart. You've done this for us. We'll listen. We trust. We'll change. We'll stand with you. And we'll obey you. We'll become yours by being immersed in water for the remission of sins, Acts 2, verse 38. And then where will we go? It's very simple. Wherever you lead us. With this confidence, we know he's planning to lead us to heaven. And if that's where you want to go, then appreciate the leadership that will get you there. If you have need this evening for any reason, won't you please come while we stand and sing?